Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Patricia Watts-Kelly, and I'm the Associate Dean of Research at the College of Nursing at the University of New Mexico. Welcome, everyone, to our Veterans Eve presentation. I thank you for coming. Today, we're going to have two topics on issues that affect veterans health, and our military service members. And I would like to ask you to kindly mute your microphones during the presentation, and then Marlena will facilitate the questions and answers. And if you can put your questions in the chat, we'll take those after the presentation. There'll be 15 minutes Q&A after each presentation. We apologize tonight for unforeseen circumstances. We were not able to provide CEs this time. We have in the past, and we plan to do so in the future. So I thank you, and please accept my apologies. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Stephen Hernandez. He is a lieutenant, he's a colonel in the Air Force Reserve, and he is an associate professor of nursing at the College of Nursing at UNM and the PhD program director. Dr. Hernandez focuses on military service members, and he's looked at perceptions of stigma and barriers to accessing mental health services, and he also is looking at resilience and stress. As I mentioned, he was commissioned. Now it says here Army Reserves, but it's the Air Force. So he joined. Huh?
Originally Army, though.
Yeah. Oh, all right. Well, we won't hold it against you. And his clinical areas of expertise are ICU, medical, surgical, trauma, and telemetry. I will now hand over the room to Dr. Hernandez, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. So I'm going to share my screen. And good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here for this special presentation focused on veterans and military service members. And happy Veterans Day to any veterans that are out there. Thank you for your service and your time commitment to serve the nation. So I will be presenting some preliminary findings from my group's research on improving resiliency in U.S. Air Force healthcare personnel. My study team includes Dr. Jackie Killian. She is a colonel in the Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where she's the senior nurse scientist for the 711th Human Performance Wing. Dr. Mark Parshall, who's a professor at the College of Nursing at UNM, Ms. Jessica Reno, our statistician at the UNM School of Medicine, and also, last but not least, Dr. Yiliang Zhu. He is also affiliated with the UNM School of Medicine. So I wanted to thank my research team for all of their contributions for getting us to this point where I can present some of the preliminary findings from the study. And I do apologize in advance. Some of you might have seen some of the beginning slides, so I hope I won't bore you too much with the repetition, but I do have some new content to also present. So acknowledgements, I wanted to make sure to thank and acknowledge the contributions of the Tri-Service Nursing Research Program for providing the grant that funded this study. The grant is awarded and administered through the Uniformed Services University of Health Services in Bethesda, Maryland. This is the second study that TSNRP has thankfully provided funding for me to complete. And for those of you who don't know, TSNRP was, and also Dr. Kelly was one of the directors of TSNRP previously, but TSNRP has the focus of not only furthering military nursing research, but also developing future nurse scientists in order to ensure that we do have robust nurse scientists that are serving in the military or who may have been retired, who can continue to focus on researching the needs of military service members and their dependents. I also wanted to thank Karen Herzing. She was our research coordinator who separated from our group in September. Without her presence at Wright-Patterson, we wouldn't have been able to recruit as well as we did and execute this study. We did use the research data capture tools for surveys that are housed at the CTSC here at UNM, and that is funded through a grant through the NIH. Also, I don't know how many people here have done any research with the military, but if you're approaching service members on a base or a military facility, you generally have to have the approval of their commanders in order to be able to even approach active duty or reserve service members. So without the approval of the U.S. Air Force School of Medicine and 88th Medical Group commanders at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, I would not have been able to achieve what we've done with this research. So I just wanted to thank them as well. And last but not least, the disclaimer that the information or content and conclusions of the presentation do not in any way represent the official position or policy, nor an endorsement to be inferred in part of DSNRP, USU, Department of Defense, or the US government. So with that, I'll proceed with the actual presentation. So the first question is, why did we start this study? So when I completed my initial dissertation research in 2012, I was examining stress and barriers to mental health care with Air Force nursing staff, whether they be a registered nurse or a medical technician. And we did this at one single installation in Texas. And what I did was I used the same measurement of stress and barriers to accessing mental health care that was used in previous studies in Operation Enduring and Operation Iraqi Freedom, service members who were combatants who had come out of a combat zone. And with my dissertation research at one facility, I found that the nursing personnel were reporting similar levels of stigma with accessing mental health care, as well as similar barriers to care that you saw reported in studies that were focused on combatants who had experienced and had been involved in combat situations where their lives were in danger. So that was very interesting that those levels were very similar. So with the help of the Tri-Service Nursing Research Program, I was able to complete a multi-site study. And we looked at stigma and barriers to accessing mental health care in Air Force nursing staff again. But we also added measurements of resilience and stress also to broaden out the study. And we used, again, the same stigma and barriers scale. And we used a resiliency scale called the Davidson 25, as well as a perceived stress questionnaire. And I provided my findings just briefly. There are publications of the study. And if anybody would like those, feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to provide copies of those. But basically, nursing personnel had concerns that accessing mental health services could harm their career and affect their leaders and peers' perceptions of their ability to do their job in the military. Stigma item responses were similar to research with soldiers and Marines assigned to combat units who had returned from Afghanistan and Iraq and had met screening criteria for a mental health disorder. So I felt that that was very significant to see that confirmed at multiple locations with a wider group of participants. There were, of course, higher levels of stigma associated with higher levels of stress and lower levels of resilience. Personnel who reported having sought mental health services in the previous 6 months had higher stress levels than those who didn't. And, the hope would be if somebody sought mental health care, then hopefully they would have some benefit from that and maybe their stress levels would be lower, but we saw the opposite. These measurements were not associated directly with treatment seeking. The majority who accessed mental health services did so during their service. but there wasn't necessarily a relationship to whether or not they had deployed to a location outside of the United States previously. And we did find lower levels of resiliency and higher levels of stress among medical technicians compared with RNs. So those are the enlisted personnel who support our registered nurses in the Air Force. So with those findings in that exploratory study being complete, the question is, what's next? So it is documented in the literature, and it's fairly well known that the Department of Defense has made resiliency training available to service members. And it is a priority where service members are provided annual training and refresher training about resiliency. However, there have been multiple literature reviews and an analysis showing that there's really not a documented or published evidence of how effective this resiliency training is. So in an era of evidence-based practice, the question is, we're offering a service, but we're not really determining how effective that service is to the service members who we really need to be resilient and prepared to do their military mission when they're called upon. So I completed a literature review to find evidence-based resiliency interventions that were already available. So in the military, there's been a push for not necessarily Department of Defense creating everything new and spending billions and billions of dollars on new systems. Instead, the push is to go find something that's readily available and apply it to the military mission need. So I took the same approach and found what's called the Stress Management and Resiliency Training Program. And it was developed by Dr. Ahmet Sood at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester when he was at Mayo Clinic. And he's since separated and begun a global center for resiliency. And you can find more information at this resilientoption.com website. So the thing that we found with this was there was actually documentation and research with smaller samples and predominantly with Mayo Clinic personnel, which is its own unique group of people. But we found that there was evidence from research showing that this training was effective in increasing resiliency and decreasing stress between 7 points, and it increased resiliency between around 8 to 11%. So for those of you who know some about statistics and effect size, the Cohen's d for that was somewhere around 0.8 to 0.11. So that's a fairly large effect from that treatment that we were seeing. So through the College of Nursing Research Endowment, I was funded to attend the Transform course in 2018. We submitted a grant to TSNRP in 2019, and we were funded with some stipulations that we met to do a single site study in San Antonio. However, as we all know, something came up around 2020 when I had finished all the stipulations and was getting ready to begin the study. And I spent some time with the Air Force supporting the DoD mission to provide some COVID relief in New York and in New York City in the borough of the Bronx. So, but during that time, the TSNRP director contacted me and said, "We'd like you to continue with your study, but we can only provide you 1 year's funding." So at the time, there was a lot of uncertainty. However, we were able to proceed with the study at a different location for a much shorter period of time. So with that, the methods that we employed for this study is to provide a pre and post-training assessment of stress and resiliency. So comparing resilience and stress levels before and after somebody had completed the SMART training program. We used stratified randomization of participants across the modes of learning, which were either computer-based training, where somebody would take 4 to 8 weeks to complete the SMART training, or we offered video teleconference meetings via Zoom to offer the 2-hour course instead. And over time, before the Delta variant emerged, I was actually able to travel to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to provide several classes in person. So I was glad that I had that opportunity. The inclusion criteria for the study was active duty Air Force healthcare professionals. So any healthcare professional who was serving at those sites, either at the School of Aerospace Medicine or at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at the 88th Medical Group. And we did a pre and post survey using RedCap to collect information about individuals' demographics, their rank in the military, what type of job they were completing or what they were doing, and then if they had had any previous deployments. We also included the GAD-7 to measure anxiety levels, 5-item quality of life scale, the Davidson 10 resiliency scale, so a brief, shorter version of the CD-25, and we moved to the perceived stress scale instead of the perceived stress questionnaire. And the rationale for using these 4 scales was to be able to compare our findings with what has been done previously and documented in the literature for the effectiveness of the SMART training with other groups. So, and just to clarify, I did say that we did we performed randomization of the participants between the computer-based or video teleconference group. We did offer, because of the nature of military service, the ability for participants to decide to switch between groups if they so chose. And this could be because of what type of work they were doing for the military. It could be they were anticipating having to be deployed. So there were some individuals who deployed during the time of our study, or it could be that they were anticipating having to do what we call permanent change of station, where they were currently stationed at Wright-Patterson and they were going to leave for another location. So if they were only there for a short time, they may not want to complete a computer-based training class that takes up to 8 weeks. They may opt for the 2-hour class instead. So we did build some ability for individuals to change their randomization if there was a need to. So we collected data at the time of enrollment, and we've also been collecting data at 12 weeks after the completion of the SMART training, as well as 18 weeks and 24 weeks after they've completed their training. And that survey is being administered through the RedCap system. For tonight's presentation, I have some descriptive statistics and paired Wilcoxon rank sum tests to compare the resilience and stress scores at 12 weeks and 18 weeks, follow up with the baseline scores. But we will eventually complete a more robust statistical analysis with group comparisons, with hopefully parametric testing as appropriate, and reporting confidence intervals and effect size estimates. As of the end of enrollment, we had considered 24 participants, 9 withdrew. We had 55 completely enrolled into the research, and a total of 46 individuals completed the intervention. So basically around 84% of those who fully enrolled into the study completed all of the training, and we're currently collecting data from those individuals. So a relatively small sample, smaller than what we had targeted. However, with everything that's going on, we're dealing with healthcare professionals who are actively involved in COVID-19 response. We were fairly happy to see that there was interest and that some individuals were able to complete the training. And the responses were enough where we've been able to complete a preliminary analysis and show some effectiveness with this training. So just briefly, some challenges that delayed our study. On top of COVID, We had some delays in approval in the chain of command with our surveys. There were travel restrictions in place, and we all know, being on Zoom isn't always as engaging as we would hope it would be. So, there's always a challenge with, number one, providing training by Zoom that's 2 hours long and making sure that people are engaged. So, but as I said, I was able to travel this summer to Wright-Patterson to actually engage and do some of the training in person. And of course, these are healthcare personnel. So some of the people at the hospital, around 110, which is approximately 10% of my target population, deployed to Detroit for COVID-19 support. So in the middle of a study, I had about 10% of my target population disappear. So, not to belabor it, but there were, ongoing challenges that we had to work with. And I think that we did a fairly good job with our research coordinator overcoming some of those challenges. So, but we've made progress. So recruitment was completed in August of 21. We offered our final classes of the in-person or video teleconference in September. And of course, we were able to complete a preliminary analysis last month. And in total, we completed 13 classes with anywhere between 2 to 8 people in each class. So it was all courses where we could have some good interaction with the participants. So just some general characteristics for the sample, and this is for the whole, for the entire sample. The majority of the sample is female. You can see that, most were 40 or above for age. The next largest category was between 30 and 34 years of age. And looking at the racial composition, the majority were white, but comparing it to the target population that we had to recruit from, this was roughly equivalent, not perfectly equivalent, but roughly. So ethnicity, we did have a small percentage of Hispanic personnel that participated. The majority of the personnel were married, and we had a roughly even mix between officer and enlisted personnel. So this is these were just some sample characteristics of the entire group that we recruited. So for just some of the preliminary results, and I apologize, this is a little bit of a reading chart, but I'd just like to focus that, number one, we have demographic characteristics that I just talked about of age, gender, marital status, ethnicity, race, and military grade. And so we compared the groups with their composition between the video teleconference group, which might also be in person, and then the computer-based training. And so what I'd like you to just focus on is that the comparing the distribution of people in those groups were not statistically, there was no statistically significant difference between the video teleconference group and the computer-based training group. So basically this means that our randomization, even though we built in some flexibility, did a fairly good job of keeping the group's characteristics fairly well distributed between the two groups of video teleconference, in-person, or computer-based training groups. So that was good to see. And then for the results that I have for tonight, just looking at the, we have results from the Davidson 10 resiliency scale and the perceived stress scale. And we compared them so far from baseline to 12 weeks post-intervention to 18 weeks post-intervention. So for the Davidson 10 scale, it's a 40-point scale. And at baseline, the median response was around 28. out of 40 on that scale. By 12 weeks post-intervention, that had increased 4 points to 32 out of 40 for the Connor-Davidson resiliency scale. So an increasing response represents increasing resiliency. So that's what you want to see with resiliency training, right? That there's improvement. And by week 18, we had seen that the median response to the resiliency scale had increased to 35. So each one of these comparisons at 12-week and 18-week to baseline are statistically significant. And not only are they statistically significant, they're very meaningful, because you see a 7-point increase out of 40 points. So that's not something that's small, okay? So this was for the overall sample. We also compared scores for the video teleconference in-person group versus the computer-based training group. For within the video teleconference group, we saw that scores increased much more quickly with that 2-hour version of the course. So the median response to the Connor-Davidson 10 was 28 at baseline for this group, and by week 12 they were at 35 already, and at week 18 they were continuing to maintain about the same level and just a little bit higher on the resiliency scale. So these were both statistically significant. With the computer-based training group, we saw a slower increase in resiliency from baseline, which was 28.5, to 12 weeks, which was 32. And by 18 weeks, though, they had caught up with the video teleconference or in-person group. So they also had an increase. Because of the numbers, I think, just from a preliminary standpoint, the 18-week difference was not statistically significant. However, with the differences being in line with what we saw with the overall sample in the video teleconference group, we are hopeful that when we get all of our data that we'll see a statistically significant difference for the computer-based training group. However, we have to wait and see what the data says. So the finding is important because we've been able to show, at least with the preliminary analysis, that the training was effective, and it was effective in a meaningful way. Then we also looked at comparing, well, were increases in resilience that was reported, was it really different between the intervention type and the delivery type? So, was it any different for video teleconference versus CBT? And we found that there is no statistically significant difference, regardless of how they received it. So either method of providing the training was effective for thus far. And again, this is preliminary for the study. So this was exciting to see that we had some good preliminary results. So the same thing with the perceived stress scale. So the higher the report of stress, the higher the number, the more stress that somebody's experiencing, the lower number, it means that they're experiencing less stress. So for the overall sample, we did see about a 3.5-point decrease over time from baseline to 12 weeks. That was statistically significant with stress levels decreasing. So with the overall sample, we saw not only did resiliency increase, but stress decreased. And again, just like with the resilience, we did compare differences between how the course was delivered, and there was not a significant, statistically significant difference between the two. So both have been thus far effective. So these are wonderful preliminary results. This is exactly what we wanted to see. And then just, I don't want to, we spent a fair amount of time discussing it, but just visually, this is a box plot just showing the differences with the quartiles of the responses. And so you can see with the resiliency scale, with the computer-based training, you have kind of a stepwise increase in resiliency over time. With the video teleconference training, you see a much more rapid increase. However, it's still sustained over time. So that's a good thing to see. And likewise, with the stress, with the perceived stress scale, computer-based training, it slowly but steadily decreased people's stress levels. With the video teleconference training, you see a more rapid decrease. However, there is no statistically significant difference between the actual decreases. So this is just a nice visual way to show the results in a non-table way. So overall, we do have a subset of participants included in the preliminary analysis. The groups did not, their demographic characteristics did not differ meaningfully between the two groups. And thus far, we've seen a 25% increase in resiliency at 18 weeks after intervention, and about an 18% decrease in stress 18 weeks post-intervention. So these are both very promising findings. However, they're not the final findings. But we're hopeful that the data will continue to show a similar trend in future analyses. So with that, we're continuing our data collection through January of 2022. We'll complete the data analysis in February of 2022. Our plan is to submit a submission for a multi-site replication study at 4 different Air Force bases in February of 2022. So we'll be able to do lead a similar study with a much larger available population to recruit from, and it will include any Air Force personnel on the base. It will not be restricted to healthcare personnel alone. So we're looking to see if we see the same response from any service member who's in the Air Force. For dissemination, I did present the same preliminary results this past week at the Sigma Theta Tau 46 biennial convention. So it was good to have a venue to just offer some preliminary results. And our final results will be presented at the Tri-Service Nursing Research Program Annual Evidence-Based and Research Conference that will be in, fingers crossed, April 2022 in person. It was virtual this past year, so we're hoping that we'll be able to do that in person. So we are currently working on a manuscript that is a literature review of available research of other resiliency programs that have been completed with military service members. So that literature review is in progress, and we also believe that we'll have a final manuscript of the study results by May of 2022, which is also when our no-cost extension is completed. So that would be wonderful timing. Also, as part of the planning for the grant submission in next year, we're currently having an additional 2 personnel trained who can be at those bases, those Air Force bases, to provide the SMART training in person. So I also have references, but feel free to contact me if you'd like either a reference list or if you would like any more information about the stress management and resiliency training program. And with that, thank you very much for attending tonight, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. Everyone, my name is Marlena Bermel, and I'm the Director of Alumni Relations for the College of Nursing. And like Dr. Hernandez said, we are now at the Q&A part of the program. So you can write your questions in the chat, or you can virtually raise your hands using the reaction button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll alternate between calling on participants and reading questions. So we'll now open it up.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Stephen. This is Patty.
Hi.
I was really excited to hear about your study because I've been working with a nurse scientist out of the Mayo Clinic who's worked with Dr. Amit Sood. And I don't know if you're aware, but your study might be the first study using the SMART program with active duty personnel. Did you know that?
Yes, so Dr. Sood had provided the training to a Air Force Reserve unit. At one time, he did it as a mass training. However, there was no assessment pre or post that was done with that that training. I did ask. So Dr. Sood said that he received a large number of positive feedback from the participants for the training. And I was hopeful that the commander would be able to provide a letter of support for the training. However, with the politics of the military, the commander didn't necessarily feel that he wanted to necessarily put that in writing. But it was good to know that this has been done with military personnel in the past. It just had not been done with a study, and there had been no data collection associated with it. And yes, I agree. There was a comment in the chat that it will be interesting to see the comparison between healthcare providers and other military personnel. I agree wholeheartedly that it's important to look at the military as a whole. However, so military research isn't always the easiest to complete, especially when you're being told that you have to complete it in 1 year. So the thing is, we went with what we could do within that year's period of time, with the knowledge that number one, I did warn the director of the program, you know, I don't know when I'm going home from New York. I don't know what the challenges may be, but all I can do is I can perform this study as rigorously as possible. And I think as a whole, the group's been able to do that. So there's no reason to think that there would be a significant difference between just healthcare personnel and the military as a whole with how they respond to this training. But until you do the research and collect the data, you just don't know. So I look forward to that.
I agree with you. I've been trying to use the same program with veterans. But I think it's great. How long was your training? Because I was under the impression it was 6 months.
Well, it takes, before COVID, you would attend 2 days at Mayo Clinic, complete the initial part of the training. You would go through 6 months of mentored feedback. And then I went back to Mayo Clinic for 1 additional day at the end in order to finish the program. So the cost of the training is around $3,000 a person. So that can be kind of costly. However, if you have something that has already been developed, there's a trade-off between developing it yourself and, you know, trademarking it versus biting the bullet and saying, this is already available, it's been shown to effective, we can do this now. So I'd rather not spend the next 5 years developing my own resiliency training.
I just wrote a HRSA grant using this SMART program. Hopefully we'll get some luck on it. We haven't heard back, but it's a wonderful program. It's exciting. Thank you, Stephen.
Yes, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about that later if you'd like.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
And I know Marlena will provide our email addresses later. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to talk with you about the the study as it is right now and some of our ongoing plans for later study. Thank you.
Thank you again. I'd now like to introduce you to our second speaker, Dr. Patricia Watts-Kelly, Associate Dean for Research and Professor for the UNM College of Nursing. Dr. Kelly has held several research and leadership positions within the federal government, including Health Sciences Officer, Department of Veterans Affairs, Office of Research and Development in Washington, D.C. Her research interests are in the areas of clinical knowledge development and continuity of care of wounded service members, military and veteran caregiver burden, health promotion, and self-care management in persons living with complex chronic conditions. Prior to retirement from the Navy, Dr. Kelly had maintained a part-time nurse practitioner practice at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, specializing in diabetes and military health. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Kelly.
Marlena, could you bring up my slides or can you give me share screen? Privileges. Okay. So I can't advance them though, right? So you'll have to advance them. Okay, that's fine. I decided tonight to do something a little different. I'm finishing up a caregiver study looking at military members, support systems from the wounded, ill, and injured service members, and to try to determine if the issues of caregivers are similar or dissimilar than the civilian population. However, I decided to do something a little different tonight because I had presented this presentation a month ago at a social justice forum, and I was surprised at how much feedback I got from this little presentation. And it was positive feedback, and people said they learned a lot about this particular issue of poverty in our junior military members. So I thought I would share this with you tonight on the eve of Veterans Day, in hopes that I can enlighten you all. So perhaps when you think about it in food insecurity and poverty in the future, you'll also think of our service members. Next slide. So I just wanted to tell you that this is the poppy and the poster for the 100th year celebration for Veterans Day, which was in 2018. Next slide. This is what Veterans Day is. Often people mix up Memorial Day with Veterans Day. And this is to remember Armistice Day, as well as the veterans and other military members who have served our country and protected our freedoms. Next slide. These are my opinions, nobody else's opinions. And seeing that I'm a retired naval officer, I need to tell you that I'm not speaking on the behalf of anyone except for myself. Next slide. So the purpose of this is to highlight the issue of poverty in our junior enlisted military families, which has now been particularly exacerbated with the COVID pandemic. Next slide. So these are what our patriots look like. They look like everybody. They look like one of us. And so they wear the family as well as the military member wear the dog tags, experience the sacrifice, miss their family member when they're deployed. They try to stick together and work together. And I am very appreciative for all of their service. Next slide. So I did a search of the literature and used match terms starting back in 2015 to the present. I looked at items such as food insecurity, military families, spousal unemployment, pandemic food stamps, which is SNAP, junior enlisted and military service organizations. I had done a previous search and looked at this in food insecurity, but the food insecurity and poverty has been exacerbated by the pandemic. So I revised it and wanted to report the updates to you all this evening. Next slide. there's an enduring poverty of the junior enlisted being paid at or below the poverty level. And it became more intensified with the pandemic because most of the junior enlisted people with families have a spouse who works outside the home, either the husband or the wife or the partner. And often they have one to several children. And with the reduction in childcare availability and with the loss of jobs, they went further into poverty. And before the pandemic, there were over 10,000 military families who needed support. But now, due to the loss of spousal income, according to the recent study at Syracuse, it's gone up. Nearly 40% of junior active duty families need food and nutrition support. I'm going to talk mainly about food because I need to explain how junior enlisted get paid. And so we know that poverty and food insecurity and lack of access to sufficient and healthy food leads to problems with one's health and ability in performance. Poor nutrition is associated with poor health, and military families used to regularly supplement their food by visiting a food bank, but then food banks have now become like a primary focus for them to really augment their food on a weekly basis, their food. And so some military families became totally ineligible for SNAP, which is the new name for what I call food stamps, because of the recent changes from the previous administration in the way they count eligibility for food. Not because the military members got a deserving pay raise, it was how the USDA decided to count benefits that are not usually taxable for housing as part of income. So in the military, if you live on base and you have a family, you get a house and you don't get the monetary benefit of rental. It's called basic housing allowance. If you have to live in an area that there is no base housing, then you get a COLA, cost of living allowance for a basic housing assistance, which means that it gives you enough money to rent a reasonably sized apartment for you, your spouse, and your children to live if you happen to be in an area that has housing, and if you're not in a terribly high income place. So for example, in the DC metro area, the guys and gals who are junior enlisted commute over an hour to an hour and a half every day to go to the Naval Hospital in Bethesda because there is no base housing and because the cost of housing in the DC metro area is so high. So not only do they get punished by having the housing assistance benefit considered as if it's taxed, then they have all the cost of gasoline and all of that. So what happens is, while it's a shameful problem, this problem has been predating the pandemic, but it has gotten worse because of the pandemic. Next slide. So I want you to see what our enlisted military gets paid. So an enlisted person called an E1 is somebody who just joins the military, and their basic pay is $1,785 a month, pre-tax. And then as they go up over time and year and rank and grade, they get a little bit of a raise. So you can see that junior enlisted personnel are usually considered 1, 2, 3, and sometimes 4. But I don't know if I could live on $2,000 a month. Now they get a little bit more, like $150 more for having a family, but it's not $150 per person in your family. It's around $150 per having a husband, a wife, or a child. So this is, you do the math, you do the calculations, and you can figure out the poverty level. So this is like the pay charts, and even the middle enlisted personnel, they don't make all that much money. I will say that the raise for this year for the military and veterans and Social Security is 5.9. It's the highest raise since the Clinton administration. So this is a good thing. Next slide. So what can you do? Well, there are senators and congressmen, both Democrats and Republicans, who are and have written bipartisan legislation to reconfigure the calculations for food stamps. So food stamps is supposed to be income, not benefits. So they want to take out the basic housing allowance out of the calculation, because then the military families who are in the poverty level or below would become eligible for food stamps again. Because if you put it in, it looks like they have a lot of money, but in actuality, they don't. So Senator Duckworth and Blackburn have put in this bill early in April last year, and it hasn't really gone anywhere. And then there's a bipartisan group of representatives who have put in a bill. And so bills, as you know, have to both go through the Senate and the House, and then they have to go into conference and everything. But I wanted to let you know about this Military Hunger Prevention Act that's in Congress and hasn't moved anywhere. Next slide. So the law would require that USDA calculate the service members' eligibility from their basic pay rather than considering their basic allowance for housing, a stipend that helps service members pay for rents or mortgages if they live off base. Right now, they count it as part of their income, and that's why they pay the military so low, because they say, well, we give you a robust benefit package. So it's true they get health care, and it's true that they can shop at the commissary. If there's a commissary near their house, then commissary prices are about 30% less than the outside supermarkets. However, not all commissaries are equal, and not all places have commissaries. And basically what happens right now is many military families have to rely on food stamps, but they don't get much in food stamps. And now they're going almost every day or once a week to the food pantries in all the areas in and around the military bases and forts and hospitals, etc., have noticed a big increase in people coming from the military for food support. And so an E3 with a spouse and one child is eligible for supplemental nutrition program according to the USDA's chart. But if they live off base, they can't, because they get this housing allowance. So if they live on base, they do better than if they live off base, but you can't always get base housing. When my husband and I were stationed in Italy, we waited 2 years to get base housing. And by the time we got base housing, or we were eligible, it was time to go back to the United States. We were fortunate enough that, I was an officer, so I didn't have this problem. But there are many military families who are trying to find housing on the economy, and it was really quite difficult. Next slide. So the United States Supplemental Assistance Program is a program to aid low-income people with obtaining food. There's a disconnect in the way you get it also, because it's administered by the Department of Agriculture and not the Department of Health and Human Services. So it's kind of an interesting disconnect. And then SNAP benefits depends on the size of the household and the income and the expenses, but they don't let you take off gasoline or all of those other costly things to do some kind of a calculation to come up with a reasonable number. Next slide. So why are our service members who protect and defend our freedoms not earning an eligible or adequate raise to feed themselves or their families? And why are our military families experiencing an additional stressor of food insecurity and poverty on top of moving frequently, spousal unemployment, childcare issues, and being deployed? Now the war has ended, but the sequelae of the war are still here. So it's just an extra stress, you know, if you can't put food, as my dad would say, on the table. Next slide. So I think it increases their stress, it decreases their military readiness. It's a problem people don't like to discuss. They don't have enough money to feed themselves or their families. The military junior enlisted personnel are historically been paid below the poverty level, and it just became worse during the pandemic, like all poverty became worse. And so I would really encourage you to look into the Military Hunger Prevention Act. This is not a political announcement. It's just me telling you what's going on currently that is trying to address the problem. And next slide. And so I just want to tell you that this is a problem, and it's something that people don't often think of because they assume that people who are in the military are paid well. And as nurses and healthcare professionals in a state that has a large military population, you may want to be cognizant of this hidden issue of food insecurity and poverty. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. We'll once again start taking questions for Dr. Kelly. As just before, you can either write them in the chat or you can virtually raise your hand and we'll call on you for any questions you might have. We have a thank you for your presentation. Dr. Montoya says, I'm sure most individuals do not recognize the issue as a problem for military. Go ahead.
I don't have a question, but I do want to thank Dr. Watts for bringing this up because this is so important. Because, you know, I was shocked back a few years ago when I found out Enlisted was getting SNAP. I thought people serving our country shouldn't even be depending on that kind of stuff. Amazing. This is maybe we need to contact our legislators about this stuff.
Dr. Quigg, the raise for Enlisted is 5.9, just like everybody else. They haven't looked at, to the best of my knowledge, moving, like doing a real adjustment for the junior enlisted as compared to, you know, military officers or senior enlisted. The whole thing works, as you know, time and service, but but this pay raise of 5.9, I worry, although it will be nice, it will also maybe put people over the threshold to where they may be still, you know, ineligible for some benefits. I think the big thing is they need to take out that BHA, that basic assistance for housing. What is that question, Marlena? I can't read it.
There's Dr. Casper says, has anyone done a study of the relationship between enlisted pay and health of the families or enlisted military?
I don't know. I don't know. That's a good question, Dean. I got into this because it just kind of upset me when I was looking at food stamp eligibility and I was looking for a social justice issue related to the military. And I knew I was volunteering at a food bank and I know people were, it's pre-COVID, and I knew people were dependent on the food banks. But that's a good question. And I don't know how I'd get at that information because people are very quiet about their food sources. But it's worth exploring. I do know that the commissary used to count the number of food stamps that they use, and they do accept the food stamps. But several years ago, the government stopped reporting some of that information. And I don't know whether they just thought it was not important or they did it to cover up the problem, but I don't want to be, you know, a suspicious, paranoid individual here now. So, but just so you're aware about those bills, and I've been trying to follow them and they're still stuck. So I don't think it'll happen this year, but maybe next year they'll get out of committee. And the service organizations are really pushing for that. But I thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Well, thank you, Dr. Kelly. We appreciate you bringing this important subject to light and sharing it with us today. If we were not able to get to your questions or you have other questions later, here are our presenters' email addresses. You are welcome to contact them directly. And we're also just put their emails in the chat, so you can copy them from there as well, if that helps you. I'm sorry. And we just want to say thank you for attending the College of Nursing Scholarship and Research Speaker Series. Our next presentation will be on mental health on February 9th in 2022. Be sure to visit our website for more information as it becomes available. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.